Hello, class, and welcome to Chapter 4. I'm going to look at some alternatives to experimentation, such as surveys and interviews. So, when you're talking about creating a survey, you want to create surveys that are relevant to your research and have information that is going to allow you to collect as much relevant data as possible that can provide um, a conclusion close to the prediction that you have created as your hypothesis for your research. So, survey research obtains data about opinions, attitudes, preferences, and behaviors using questionnaires or interviews. So, questionnaires could definitely be a survey approach, which is going to allow researchers to study private experiences, which you would not be necessarily able to directly observe. So, with surveys can be very beneficial because it allows you to efficiently collect a large amount of data at one time. You can get anonymous surveys, and it can increase the accuracy of how people respond to questions that may be sensitive or private. Surveys can also allow you to draw inferences about the causes of particular types of behavior, and it can definitely complement other parts of your experiment, um, such as lab work or field experiments. The survey approach does not allow us to necessarily test hypotheses about causal relationships because we do not manipulate independent variables and control extraneous variables when we are conducting a survey. But it can provide some insight to some particular um, factors that could be important to highlight some of um, challenges or factors or behaviors that are part of uh, your research question. So, how do you create a good survey? Well, one of the best ways to create surveys is to use closed questions or open ended questions. So, we're going to talk about that. So, the structure of your questions will provide you with large amounts of information, or maybe we want to make it more simplistic and that information be very straight to the point or straightforward. So let's look at closed-ended questions. Your closed-ended questions or closed questions are structured questions. So these questions can be answered using a limited number of alternatives, but have a high response. So for an example, if I ask one particular question, how many songs did your roommate illegally download this month? You can simply say 4. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to provide an explanation. It's very direct, a very direct question that provides one response, one or two responses. So a closed question or closed-ended question is different than an open-ended question. So these questions are more open. They allow for more explanation. It allows for an in-depth response from the participant and gives you um, more information to apply to your data. So an open-ended question requires that the participants respond with more than one response, or a yes or no, or a numerical value. Um, so for an example, why did you choose your major? Okay, so if you ask the question, why did I choose my major? You can explain more in depth. I chose my major because, and then answer the question with a broader point of view. So how do researchers analyze data from each type of question? The number or the percent of responses can be reported from closed questions, but open-ended questions can be analyzed using content analysis. So we can take content and read through that content and pull out themes that can be important or that are listed um, multiple times within the data that shows us some level of consistency throughout our results. So let's look at the different type of scales when we are conducting our research. So we have the nominal scale. Our nominal scales allow us to assign different categories or distinct categories that can be named using different types of features, but does not measure their magnitude. So I may have, for an example, um, males versus females. I can take that category, males, and then I can take that category, females, and place them into categories. And I can also do numerical values as well. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So here's another example. You can sort professors into exciting and dull categories. So if my overall category was professors, I could do a nominal scale and give it a name. I can say, this is going to be my column for exciting professors, and then this is going to be my category for dull professors. Giving a name, nominal, giving a name or a category to a particular distinct um, feature is what we call nominal scales, creating a nominal scale. So then we have the ordinal scale. The ordinal scale measures the magnitude of the dependent variable, and it provides ranks to that particular value. So for an example, contestants may finish first place, then last place. So we put them in order. So I have first place, second place, third place, fourth place, etc. So we give them an order in which they rank based on their um, their score, for an example. Okay, so ordinal scale, that keyword, think of order in ranking. Then we have the interval scale. Interval scales measures the magnitude of the dependent variable using equal intervals between values with no absolute zero. So if you think about Fahrenheit um, or temperatures, or if you think about the all of the points with between 1 and 2 can create an interval scale. So an interval scale can be 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and etc. Does not necessarily fall at a zero or absolute point value. Versus a ratio scale, a ratio scale has an absolute zero. So that is your absolute whole number, your 1, your 2, your 3. Or if we're looking at distance in meters, for an example, we would use a ratio scale. So why should you consider creating a survey to collect data? Well, subjects decide to refuse to answer surveys um, during the start of the first few questions. So we want to make sure that when we think about using surveys to collect data, we want to make sure that the questions are engaging, and start by asking interesting questions that people may not mind answering. So, when you think about creating the first question for your survey, you want to think about these 5 important elements. You want the question to be relevant to the central topic, and you want the question to be relatively easy to answer. You also want it to be interesting so that you can pique the participants' interest in completing the survey and make it answerable by most respondents. If you think it's something that most people may tend to answer, or you could even do a pilot survey to see if people would be responsive to answering particular questions. And then you want to have a closed format so that um, you can get some straightforward answers as opposed to roundabout, broad answers to those questions. So let's talk about the response set and how people tend to respond to questions. And one of those major things would be to think about social desirability. A social desirability response set is us representing ourselves in a socially appropriate fashion when we are responding to questions. So there may be some underlying meaning to the way that we respond based on how we want to be perceived. So, for an example, you may dress formally for a job interview where you may not be a very formal or business like person in your dress on a day to day basis, but you're going to show up and dress to impress for that job interview rather than wearing your favorite jeans that may have holes in it or your favorite sweats that you don't care how it's presented. So people tend to respond the same way in for surveys or even in interviews because they want to appear socially desirable and not necessarily showing that side of them that may not be desirable. So let's look at the differences between structured interviews and unstructured interviews. Structured interviews provides questions that are asked at the same time, at the same way, each time they are conducted with different people. So this provides more usable, quantifiable data because every question is exactly the same. And so, for an example, people will tend to answer similarly, or you'll get similar responses to those interview structured questions. So, there's no deviations from that actual interview. Whereas unstructured interviews, you kind of allow the the interview to take its own place. You might ask one question, but there's not going to be necessarily a specific follow up question. That question can lead into another question based on how the participant answered the previous question. So the interviewer can explore interesting topics as they arise, and then you can take that information and use it for content analysis. So let's look at the relationship of a sample and why samples are important. After we while we're in the process of collecting our data, we want to talk about things like um, uh, what a population is, what a sample is, and how this applies to our actual research. So let's do some conceptual definitions. So your population consists of all of the people, all of the animals, or all of the objects that share one characteristic. So if I am looking at a particular population, say I'm looking at a particular ethnicity, then I would look at everyone in the general population that applies to that ethnicity. So if I'm looking at Asian Americans, then I can say that Asian Americans are my general population. That's the population. Whereas the sample, I'm going to take a subset, a portion of the population that I am studying, say Asian Americans, so that they can represent the general population that I am studying. Okay, so what are the advantages of sampling versus a non-sampling? Well, a probability sample is more likely to represent the population as a whole, which will state that in previous lectures we talked about internal validity versus external validity. Well, this representation of the population would represent or highlight external validity, meaning that we could take this information and apply it to the general population versus um, uh, say a non-probability sampling. We know that exact odds of members of the population being included in our sample um, we would hope that this tells us the sample's representation, but this could be a little bit tricky at times because not always, if we don't do this broad enough or take um, consider individuals maybe across the world that are in this particular group that we are studying, say Asian Americans. If we don't go to Asian Americans who live in Alabama and Asian Americans who live in California and Asian Americans who live um, in another country somewhere in Thailand or something, you have to make sure that you have a broad enough range to cover that particular population and represent well um, in your sample for that population. There are four main probability sampling methods, which include simple random sampling, which is getting the convenience of anyone who is present. Systematic random sampling, you have a system of how you um, add uh, people into their group. So, for example, I might say 1, 2, 3, 4. Everybody who is number one, go into this group. Everybody who is number two, go into that group. Four, go into the next group. Five, go into the next group. We do that a lot of times in classes, right? When we want to create groups. So we have a system of how we randomly place individuals into a particular group. Stratified sampling, we may say every fifth person goes into the group. So we call that the nth. So meaning the ninth person, the fifth person, the fourth person will go into a particular group randomly. Okay, and then clustered sampling, we kind of cluster people by categories. So I may say all of the males go into this group, all of the females go into this group, all of the males ages 21 to 25 go into this group. So we cluster people into the groups um, by some particular characteristic or category. The four main non-probability sampling includes quota sampling, convenience sampling, and purposive sampling, as well as snowball sampling. I want you to take time to check out your resources in your textbook and look at quota sampling, convenience sampling, and purposive sampling, and snowball. I'm going to give you a hint with the convenience sampling. Convenience against it is just talking to anyone that you can get to add them into your um, your um, group that you're creating. Or I make to say snowballing. And snowballing is going to be type of sampling that you ask this one person, hey, do you know anybody that is of the Asian culture? And then this person says, yeah, hey, I know John who is of the Asian culture. I'll let him know that you're doing a study on Asian Americans and see if he knows anyone. So you do the snowball effect and get the peak participants that you need to add them to the group. So I want you to take a look at quota and purposive sampling and see if you can process what those types of non-probability samplings look like. And that is going to end our session for today.